The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello there, welcome back to another brand new episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. This episode is going to be very emotional. It's the story of one of the most devastating tragedies in living memory, but it's also going to be both astonishing and inspirational in parts too. This is the story of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, and more specifically, a few of the unbelievable coincidences that led to the survival of a number of those caught up in it, as well as tales of the heroes who defied the odds to help save lives when all hope appeared to be lost. There are going to be lots of upsetting details in this episode, but I really believe that both the wider story and these specific accounts deserve to be continually commemorated. So let's begin. If you're old enough to remember Boxing Day of 2004, I'm sure it will be one of those days where you can recall exactly where you were when the news of this terrible disaster emerged. I vividly remember being in the living room of my grandparents' house at a festive gathering with my family when we decided to turn on the TV and first saw the news. The world's media had received reports of an enormous tsunami resulting from an undersea 9.1 to 9.3 magnitude earthquake that had occurred off the coast of the Indonesian island of Sumatra at just before 8 a.m. local time. The tsunami, which is a series of unthinkably giant waves triggered by things like earthquakes within the ocean, had hit the coasts of several countries, including Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India, and even reached as far across the Indian Ocean that it impacted places like Somalia too, around 4,500 kilometers away from the epicenter of the earthquake. For reference, according to National Geographic, the energy released by the earthquake was equivalent to around 23,000 Hiroshima-level atomic bombs. When I say that these waves that hit the coastlines of the affected countries were huge, I'm not necessarily just talking about the height of them. Although there were reports of some of the waves reaching heights of over 50 meters in places like Sumatra, as I understand it, it's also the length and power of tsunami waves that contribute to why they are just so dangerous. What many of the affected areas experienced were these walls of water that not only hit the coastlines but had so much force and such a volume of water behind them that they travelled far inland too, up to 3 miles inland in some cases. It's almost impossible for me to describe in words the true extent of the devastation the tsunami caused, but the numbers paint a clearer picture of why this 2004 disaster is considered one of the deadliest since records began. It's believed that an estimated 228,000 people lost their lives after being caught up in the tsunami. 228,000 souls, and possibly more, up to 230,000 people according to some sources, who all perished under the most terrible circumstances imaginable. Now, in the 2+ decades since this tragedy occurred, there have been numerous articles written looking back at the disaster, analysing why it was able to claim the lives of so many. According to the British Geological Survey, it appears that there were 3 factors which, when combined together, do help to explain why the outcome was so awful. Firstly, the earthquake was unexpected. From my understanding, it's notoriously difficult, borderline impossible in fact, to predict major earthquake events, and this one was enormous. There's still some debate about exactly where on the Richter scale it lands, but most sources cite between 9.1 and 9.3. And when you bear in mind that the largest earthquake ever recorded measured 9.5 on the Richter scale, you realize just how gigantic it really was. Secondly, there was a lack of a tsunami warning system in place for the Indian Ocean area, as opposed to places like the Pacific Ocean, where undersea earthquakes are more common, who have had a warning system in place since around the 1940s. As described by the Australian Geographic, quote, "On the day, seismic signals picked up by stations in Australia were the first to trigger an alert at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii." They added, "When it was realized how significant the quake was, however, the response was haphazard. Back in 2004, we didn't know where to send the warning in the Indian Ocean. We didn't have national contacts," says Dr. Richard Bailey, head of tsunami warning and ocean services with Australia's Bureau of Meteorology. Tsunami waves travel at speeds of up to 800 kilometers an hour, depending on the depth of the water. In 2004, it took anywhere from 15 minutes to 7 hours for Somalia for the fatal waves to reach the various coastlines. Hampered by a lack of a plan for the Indian Ocean, governments and relevant organizations were alerted, but many were fatally slow to react. The northern regions of the Indonesian island of Sumatra were hit very quickly, while Sri Lanka and the east coast of India and Thailand were affected 2 hours later. However, in many places, no evacuation measures were taken. And this leads us on to the third point, which was that many of the authorities, locals, and tourists within the affected areas simply didn't know or understand what they were in for, or what the appropriate response should be. For many of the communities hit by the tsunami, this was an unprecedented incident, and they were caught completely off guard. There is truly so much more I could tell you about the tsunami, its impact, and the aftermath. And I will be touching on some of these later on. But for the purposes of this episode today, I now want to talk about 2 specific stories within this wider event. Both of these tales are incredible. The first one in particular is one of those accounts that I've told to a few people in my real life during the process of researching this episode, and they have all had a physical reaction in the form of chills or goosebumps or even getting emotional. This is the story of the then 10-year-old British schoolgirl Tilly Smith. On the 26th of December 2004, Tilly had been on holiday with her family in Phuket, Thailand, and that morning the Smiths had decided to take a walk along the private beach close to the JW Marriott hotel they were staying at. As they wandered, Tilly was casually looking out towards the ocean when she noticed something that instantly set off alarm bells in her mind. In her own words, quote, "I saw this bubbling on the water right on the edge and foam sizzling just like in a frying pan. The water was coming in, but it wasn't going out again. It was coming in and then in and then in towards the hotel." In that moment, Tilly turned to her mum, Penny, and told her in no uncertain terms, "I know there's something wrong. I know it's going to happen. The tsunami." Now, although her daughter seemed incredibly sure of what she was saying, Penny replied that it was simply another day at the beach, and she clearly didn't think that anything out of the ordinary was going on. But when Tilly received this response, she became incredibly upset, repeating that she was certain that a tsunami was rapidly approaching the spot where they were standing. nothing. Tilly's 7-year-old sister Holly was starting to become frightened by her older siblings' warnings and started to run off back towards the hotel, closely followed by their dad Colin. Penny continued her walk along the beach, and though she was torn, Tilly knew that she had to both get away from the water and continue to raise the alarm, and that is what she did. After heading back to where they were staying, Tilly came across the hotel's chef, and she told him what she suspected was about to happen. Now, the chef was originally from Japan, and he immediately recognized the term tsunami, as it's actually a Japanese word meaning harbor wave. Her dad Colin had, by this point, also realized that something didn't feel right, and that his eldest daughter's reaction warranted him at least trying to spread the word that things had looked unusual down on the beach. He found some security guards and informed them of Tilly's beliefs, and the guards quickly acted on the information. They went onto the beach, where there were families out walking or swimming in the sea, and told them to evacuate the area immediately. At this point, Penny had started to become concerned enough that she wanted to check that her daughter was okay. From what I've read, it seems as though she was still not convinced about the tsunami warning, but was more worried about Tilly's emotional state, so she set off back towards the hotel. As she reached a high-up bank positioned between the beach and their hotel, she looked back at the water, and to what I can only assume was her absolute horror, she saw a huge wave approaching the shoreline. Colin and their daughters were in the hotel's pool when they spotted Penny sprinting back towards them, screaming at her husband to get the girls out of there. Tilly has described the moment she saw her mother running to them, saying that it was as though the water was chasing her. Penny explained, quote, "It was right behind us, and by then both of the girls were hysterical and I was screaming. I swear to God, I thought I was going to die." The family initially ran into the lobby of the hotel before heading up to the 3rd floor of the building to try and get themselves out of the path of the surges of water. Miraculously, their hotel was positioned just far enough from the shore that it wasn't destroyed by the 3 separate tsunami wave surges it was hit by. The outside areas of the hotel, however, told a different story. The water was so powerful that it had wiped out everything in its path. It had downed palm trees and swept up every movable item in sight, carrying them along and depositing them in the grounds of the hotel. But thanks to the bravery, quick thinking and tenacity of 10-year-old Tilly Smith, when the chaos of the tsunami surges struck, over 100 people were able to make it out of the impact zone with enough warning that they escaped with their lives. Without Tilly's warning, her mother explained that, quote, "Even if you hadn't drowned, you would have been hit by something," adding, "I'm convinced that if Tilly hadn't said something, I would have stayed on the beach." And I think it's safe to say that there were at least 100 other people who would also echo this sentiment. So, this leads us to the question I'm sure you've been asking throughout this story. Why was Tilly so adamant that a tsunami was imminent? This is one of those coincidences that is so strange, it just gives you goosebumps, no matter how many times you read or hear about it. As it turns out, just 2 weeks prior to the Smith family flying to Thailand, back at her school in Surrey, the class she was in had been taught about tsunamis by their teacher, Andrew Kearney. Mr. Kearney had showed his students a video of a previous tsunami that had occurred, and both the lesson and the footage must have still been incredibly clear in Tilly's mind, as she recognised some of the signs of the impending disaster almost immediately. For reference, according to the American Red Cross, quote, "A natural sign of a tsunami may be your first, best, or only warning that a tsunami is on its way. Natural signs include an earthquake, a loud roar from the ocean, or unusual ocean behavior, such as a sudden rise or wall of water, or a sudden retreat of the water, showing the ocean floor. If you experience any of these signs, a tsunami could be coming. Immediately move to higher ground or inland away from the coast. Don't wait for an official alert." Speaking about this area of his teaching work, Mr. Kearney said, quote, "I taught Tilly the coursework, which included a section on tsunami. She worked very well, and she is a very intelligent, bright pupil. I have taught it for the past 4 or 5 years, and we have always spent time on this particular subject. Kids like something dramatic, and they were drawn to it and enthusiastic about anything spectacular. Tilly is not alone in that. Obviously, it puts her in good stead for what happened in Thailand. It just shows you that disaster management comes into play at higher education level in universities and colleges, but there is a place for it in junior geography, as this proves." I thought that was such a humble response from him, considering that he had essentially been responsible for equipping a young girl with knowledge that very soon afterwards ended up helping to save the lives of over 100 people. After returning back to England and after news of this astonishing story had spread, Tilly and her family ended up being invited to the United Nations in New York to meet the former US President Bill Clinton, as Clinton was the UN envoy for the tsunami recovery. Subsequently, several UN-made videos featuring Tilly's story were released, and in one of them, Mr. Kearney spoke about the importance and power of education, and how, in this case, it had meant the difference between life and death for a large group of people. Tilly added that if it wasn't for her teacher, then both herself and her family would likely be dead. But I think a huge amount of credit should also be placed on Tilly for not only paying such close attention to her schoolwork, but also for being bold enough to speak up when she was so sure she was right. Of course, this story is amazing and is definitely one of the most widely cited tales of heroism and survival associated with the 2004 tsunami, particularly within the Western media. But what if I were to tell you that there was yet another bizarre coincidence that had taken place the exact same year, which resulted in yet further lives being saved during the disaster? I think the reason why this tale isn't more widely spoken about is because it appears that pretty much all of the news reports about it came out of Germany and were, of course, in German. It doesn't look as though they were picked up by the media either here in the UK or across the pond, so I am relying on a translation service for this. But as I'm sure you'll agree, this is in many ways just as miraculous as Tilly's tale. Earlier on in 2004, there had been a brand new book published by the German science fiction writer Frank Schätzing, Der Schwarm, which I'm sure you probably guessed translates to The Swarm. The novel is set in an apocalyptic world where nature appears to be fighting back against the abuses of humans by way of an intelligent life force found living within the ocean. One of the results of this, one of the main catastrophes that occurs within the book, is a giant tsunami. Now, when the novel was released, it became an instant hit within countries where German is widely spoken, and it was also later translated into other languages too. But thanks to the novel's immediate success, it meant that a number of people who had been within the impact zones of the 2004 tsunami had read or were actively reading The Swarm when this awful event unfolded. Therefore, like Tilly, many of them were able to spot the signs of the approaching tsunami and get themselves and their their loved ones out of the path of danger with moments to spare. And one of these people was then 14-year-old German teenager Simon Fadenreich. On Boxing Day of 2004, Simon had been on holiday in Sri Lanka with his mother Heike and his younger brother Nelson. On that morning, they would have ordinarily been down at the beach near to where they were staying, but as chance would have it, they had been at a birthday party the previous evening, hosted by the instructor who had been teaching Simon how to dive throughout their holiday. So instead of being on the beach, they were in their accommodation. Heike was eating breakfast and Nelson was observing a hummingbird that had landed on a nearby flower, while Simon had decided to take a shower. According to a Frankfurt newspaper, and bear in mind that all of these are translations, Simon explained, quote, "I remember that I was standing in the shower and suddenly there was a noise like giant turbines, a wild commotion, the cries of monkeys and birds and the barking of dogs. It felt like everyone had suddenly gone crazy." After he was finished showering, he recalled that from their accommodation, he saw a sudden rush of brown water surging forward, filling their front garden and bringing all kinds of debris along with it. His mother ordered him to come up to the first floor, and from there he saw that the water was rising higher and higher before receding backwards. At this moment, Simon had a crystal clear realization. There was about to be a tsunami. He ran outside, wanting to confirm his suspicions with his own eyes. But from here, he says his memories are quite fuzzy. This is genuinely both horrific and heartbreaking. But Simon has explained that his last real memories of this exact time are seeing huts flattened all around the area and bodies washed up on the beach. Simon's mother, Heike, says that after her eldest son came back from the beach, she remembers his face looking, quote, green and yellow, implying that he looked physically ill. The words he spoke to her were simple. "It's a tsunami. It's like in the swarm." And, thank goodness, Heike didn't doubt him for a second. She grabbed her two sons and they headed straight for the nearby Temple Mountain, climbing high enough just in time to ensure their lives were saved. Just like in Tilly's case, the fast thinking of this young person had most certainly been the difference between life and death for himself and his family. The three of them remained at this higher ground for around 2 days, along with others who had sought refuge there, and from their position they were able to witness the horror that had taken place on the lower down land. They described seeing survivors pulling the bodies of the poor souls who had been caught up in the waves from the water, and how the lack of food and drink meant that they could not simply sit around and wait for a rescue party to turn up. Simon, Heike and Nelson were able to get a lift with a French family and were taken away from the mountain, knowing that they were all incredibly lucky and aware that they would never be able to forget the awful things they had seen. In this same news article from the publication in Frankfurt, it also explains that following the news about the tsunami breaking, the Swarm's author Frank was immediately contacted by multiple news outlets, asking him for his opinion on the disaster. They considered him somewhat of an expert on tsunamis, due to the extensive amount of research he had done on them during the course of writing The Swarm, but it appears as though Frank was a bit uneasy about this. From what I've read, I think he was very aware that what he had written was a work of fiction, and what had happened in the numerous countries affected by the Boxing Day tsunami was tragically very, very real. As time went by, he heard stories like Simon's, and another from a Swiss couple, which is also so strange it's almost unbelievable. It's said that the husband and wife were sat on a beach, the man reading a copy of The Swarm, when he looked out at the ocean and realized that what he was looking at was horrifyingly similar to the passage he happened to be reading at that exact moment. The couple decided to run, and they survived the enormous waves that hit the beach a short time later. And it appears as though these tales gave Frank a different perspective and helped him realize that amongst the unimaginable loss, his work had inadvertently helped to save lives. Now, once they were back in Germany, Simon and his family appeared on television, telling the story of what had happened to them, as well as informing people about the foundation that Hiker had set up, with the aim of helping the people of Sri Lanka rebuild after the tsunami. Following their TV appearance, they were able to raise a total of €500,000 for the foundation. And bearing in mind that this was the mid-2000s, this really was a huge amount of money. It is amazing, and just another reason I think these stories have been so important for me to share. But this leads me on to the final and most significant part of this episode, which is the heartfelt acknowledgement of the endless heroic stories featuring the people local to the affected countries. These are the accounts that don't feature the kind of bewildering coincidences that the previous two did, and aren't necessarily the first story cited when you start combing through press coverage about the heroes of the 2004 tsunami. They're the tales of the everyday people who call the affected countries home, the people who, in many cases, lost absolutely everything, but still carried out incredible acts amongst the chaos. We may not have anywhere near as much detail or information when it comes to their stories, but these are the people whose accounts deserve to be amplified tenfold. People like Mayudin from Sumatra Island, a fisherman who tragically lost his wife and son in the disaster. Mayudin had been out in the ocean in his fishing boat when the tsunami waves started to surge. By some miracle, after being advised to head further out into the sea, his small vessel was able to survive the 3 large waves that moved towards the shoreline. On his way back to land, he was able to pick up a number of survivors from the water, rescuing people who would have certainly perished had he not pulled them into his boat. Or the Indonesian midwife Nur Azaya, who, after witnessing the waves completely destroy her entire village, was called to help a pregnant woman who was about to give birth amongst the destruction and debris. Nur travelled on foot to find the woman, even though this would have been a treacherous journey, and was able to help her deliver the baby on an area of grass, despite having absolutely no equipment or medication or anyone else to assist her. Yet thanks to Noor's care, both the mother and the baby survived. Or the Sri Lankan train guard, Wanigaratne Karunatilake, who was working on board the Ocean Queen Express train when the tsunami hit. An initial wave had brought the packed out train to a stop, but as no one had any idea what was going on, no clue whatsoever that subsequent deadly waves were incoming, they were in a very precarious position when these waves did strike. The train was derailed and essentially destroyed, with as many as 1,700 people thought to have lost their lives, making it the worst rail disaster in history. The guard did everything he could to try and save as many people as possible, including hoisting children up from the flooded carriage he was in in and managing to place them into another one he thought was safer, only to see that carriage wiped out moments later. Although his endeavours were immense, he now lives with the feeling that if they had had more knowledge about what was taking place around them, far more lives could have been saved. And he is clearly emotionally scarred by this despite his heroic efforts. And this is without even mentioning the thousands, tens of thousands of people whose names we don't know, whose stories were never reported, who would have been the ones helping their communities, coordinating rescue efforts, caring for the injured, and ultimately rebuilding after they had lost everything. All of that takes levels of heroism that most of us won't ever be able to fully understand. Then, of course, we have the humanitarian organisations who formed part of the response to the tsunami, as well as the teams who worked afterwards to develop a tsunami warning system for the Indian Ocean. Due to the sheer scale of this event, the number of stories I could tell you are almost unquantifiable. But whether it's an account that made headlines or one that's more so remembered amongst one of the impacted communities, each and every one of the 2004 tsunami heroes deserves to be paid tribute to, and the events of that awful December day and beyond never, ever forgotten. Oh my goodness, I know this was an especially heavy episode, but as soon as I started to learn more about these stories, I just knew I had to share them on the podcast. I would be so interested to know whether you had heard about any of these tales before, or how much you knew about the 2004 tsunami in general prior to this. Are you also old enough to remember it happening? And if so, what do you recall hearing about it at the time? As always, please do join me in keeping the conversation going in the comment section or over on our social media pages. I'll be letting you know about the various ways you can get in touch very soon. But for now, it's time to move on over to our weird media outro feature. Now, putting this emotional episode together has also coincided with me reading a super emotional book, and I'm recommending it in Weird Media today, not because the subject matter is strange, but because the idea behind the book feels quite unique and unusual. I've never read something like this before, and it was quite something. The novel in question is The Names by Florence Knapp. The basic premise of the book is this. We're initially introduced to the character of Cora, who has just given birth to a baby boy. When the baby is a few weeks old, she now has the task of registering his birth, and on her way to the registry office, she is battling with herself between 3 different names. Bear, the suggestion of her daughter, Julian, a name she likes and hopes her husband would come to approve of, or Gordon, her husband's name. Now at this point, I have to give a major content warning if you were thinking of checking out the names, that the themes of domestic violence and domestic abuse run deeply through the entire book, so do take care when deciding if this is something you want to read. But without revealing any of the plot from here on out, the novel follows 3 potential realities. One where Cora names her son Bear, one where she calls him Julian, and one where she picks Gordon. There are multiple time leaps between the sets of 3 chapters, so you'll get a Bear, Julian and Gordon chapter for a certain year, then it will skip ahead a number of years before we catch up with each reality again. I have to be honest that when I first started reading the names, it was so emotionally difficult to take in that I wasn't sure if I was enjoying it. But the further I got into it, I started to fall in love with so many of the characters and appreciate the amazing work Florence Knapp had done as an author too. I will leave it at that because I don't want to give any more away. But if you feel prepared for an intense and upsetting yet incredibly thought-provoking and at times beautiful read, I think The Names is a book that will stick with you in your soul for a long time after you turn the final page. A big thank you for joining me for this episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. I know this has been a tough one, so do be sure to take care of yourselves after listening. I know that for me, I need to go and watch or listen to something more light-hearted after I'm done recording. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including links and shout-outs to all of the sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing our social media pages and our email address. If you're joining us on Spotify or YouTube, please feel free to leave us a comment. And you can also get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook or TikTok and tell me all about your thoughts on today's story. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a fantastic free way to support the show. Finally, if you are watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.